happy that you came for the opening lecture of our public program within summer school, Feministic Urbanism, Urbanistic Feminism, Principles of Gender-Sensitive Planning. And I'm happy to present our keynote speaker, Professor Marion Roberts. She offered a topic or a subject. We'll find out. Is it a topic or a subject for the lecture? In a way, I like most of all, really, the style you put it. Engendering cities, overcoming the barriers. So I hope you will find a lot of new information today, and we'll ask questions also. Just one more word about Marion. She's a professor of urban design on the Faculty of Architecture and the Built Environment of the University of Westminster, that is in London in United Kingdom. And there is a big list of publications, but not to take time. Maybe you will tell yourself about your books. So now let's test microphone.
Hello, can you hear me at the back? There we are.
No.
Hello, can you hear me?
I think it makes no difference.
It makes no difference.
Does it make difference now?
How about now? No.
How about now?
Can you hear me?
Yes. You don't need a mic for that.
Okay, I shall just speak loudly and clearly.
It works because I hear the sound.
And slowly. But if at some point you don't hear me or I am going too fast, because I know listening to a foreign language...
It was simply turned off.
Oh, right. Okay, is this better? Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you for welcoming me to Kiev, which I hope I am pronouncing properly. We say Kiev, which I'm sure is wrong, in the UK, and to your very interesting and important city. And I would like to thank Svetlana, Vladislava and Maria for looking after me so well so far, and to the Heinrich Böll Foundation for sponsoring this summer school and this event. To say a little bit more about me. It must be a female cat coming to this as well. I have been interested in gender issues for a very long time. I did my PhD thesis on gender divisions and housing design back in the 1980s. And I've followed up over the years with different scholarly works. But my most recent experience in this area has been really sponsored by the European Commission, who sponsored a target top-down policy-driven network called Gender STE, and that was gender in science, technology and the environment. And it sponsored a series of meetings and research conferences for 4 years, and only ended with our final conference in Madrid in November 2016. So that's been a very useful forum, and it has encouraged a lot of younger researchers to join in and to take up this topic. And I'm currently involved in a German network sponsored through the Academy for Raumforschung und Landungsplanung, and we are in Hanover, the University of Leibniz, and we are going to publish a book on gender and spatial development that will cover some other European member states in 2018. but a lot of the information or some of the thinking that I will present today comes from discussions within those two groupings. And I would like to I will be referring to colleagues in those networks as I talk, as I present, and I hope that you will be able to look up their works, a lot of which is published in English, but there's also a very good tradition of gender-sensitive planning in Germany, to which English speakers have had little access so far. So we hope that this will become more available with our new book. The book that meant much of the information here is based on is called Fair Shared Cities, that the leader of our network, Ines Sanchez de Madariaga, and I co-edited. It was published in 2013, but the English publisher Routledge, or the English US publisher Routledge, have republished it, and it is available so that you can download chapters from the book. So if you find something that I say that you find interesting here, and would like to know more about it, if you go to Fair Shared Cities, you can download a particular chapter to follow up with more information and more detail. And I understand this talk will be published on the web, so some of the names you will be able to see from the PowerPoint presentation. But other than that, I'm not going to talk so much about, show slides of the book or anything. So, yes, it's very good to be in Kiev. Again, I came here last year for a conference in March, and I was trying to think of how much we had in common, and looking out of because the UK and the Ukraine have very, very different trajectories and histories. So looking out of the window at my hotel, I could see the Maidan, big national square, centre of political activity, and I thought, well, yes, in the UK we also have something like that. Trafalgar Square is probably only a quarter of the size, but it is a place also for a history of demonstrations. And one of my tutors at university wrote a book about it. And it appears that we have other things in common. Maria, who was in the taxi with me from the airport, was telling me about the rave parties that have become so popular here and that have made Kiev an international destination for young people. So, and Britain, as you know, is well known for young people enjoying a party. So, and I think it's in young people like you that we shall see the future, and particularly the future of engendering cities. Because I think it's highly appropriate now that we are returning to issues with the fourth wave of feminism, to issues about gender and changing cities for the better. Engendering cities has long been an aim of the women's movement. The Beijing Fourth Women's World Conference in 1995 made a resolution about gender mainstreaming and women's empowerment, which was later formally adopted by the United Nations and has become part of their programme. The European Union followed suit in 1999 with the Treaty of Amsterdam, which placed a requirement on all member states within the European Union to gender mainstream, not only in their own organisations, but in their policies and in their practices. And so there's been a lot of effort, a lot of rhetoric, but there really hasn't been a huge dramatic change in the form and in the layout of our cities, nor in the organisation of housing and neighbourhoods, although we have seen some inspirational examples in the Global South and in Europe. So this is disheartening. I mean, this is one of the reasons that the European Commission gave us funding for the Gender STE network, because they felt that the impetus, particularly towards research, towards policy action in the field of gender and the urban environment, had stalled, and that, you know, little progress was being made. So I think the important thing, though, is not to be disheartened. The fact that you are all here and that you're interested in this topic, and there's a resurgence of young people's engagement in politics across Europe, across the world, demonstrates a desire for change and a desire to change the power relations between women and men. But I think what we need to do, and I use a sort of royal we, and as I get older, I guess I'll be retiring and I'm passing the baton on to young people like you. What we need to do is to think about how do we make real change in our towns and cities. What can we do to change the kind of problems that we are all facing just in everyday life? What kind of structural transformation can be made in terms of human habitat? So I'm doing this lecture in 4 sections. Firstly, just setting out the ground rules, or if you like, the grounding for my lecture, where I'm coming from, discussing gender and gender plus as a concept, and I'm sorry if this is something you're already very familiar with, but I think it just helps to set out what the understandings are. Then to look at some concepts and techniques for gender mainstreaming in urban planning and urban environment. And then we might pause for a little Q&A. It's a hot evening. And then we might consider some examples of gender mainstreaming in the urban environment, then critiques of gender mainstreaming, some more Q&A, and if there's any time over, we can also, I have a few slides on contemporary challenges to the city that are coming up over the last, sort of bubbling around in academic circles. So then at that point, we can also move to those. So first of all, to talk about women, gender and gender plus. The first and second wave of feminism raised the issue of inequality, and particularly women's inequality in relationship to men. And what we did in the 60s and 70s was set up women-only groups, protested about unequal wages, about sexual stereotypes, and some of those are still carrying on. In my house, I've had some building work, and I've had a young woman working as part of the building team, and she says in her school, still boys are trained to be bricklayers, and the girls, she's only 15, are put into domestic science. So this questioning of both the vertical and horizontal segregation of the labour force was part of the project, as well as recovering women's history. And so it challenged the discussion of social class as the key social divider. And more than that, it proposed different types of political action, having action groups where there were no hierarchies, where every woman had an equal voice, and which formed a contrast to the conventional politics of the day, which was organised very much in hierarchies, formalities, motions and order. And I think that form of collective action and collectivity still holds some power today. So in terms of planning and building, this led us to a renewed interest in collective forms of living within the household and between groups of household. And I think we criticised the family as an institution and of the subordinate role of women in the family structure. And the collective book that the group of feminist architects I was first involved with, called Making Space, was a product of this second wave of feminism, as was my own PhD thesis. But as we have moved through thinking about through issues of gender, sex, sexual identity, we have thought more fundamentally about issues of essentialism and the need to not categorise women as a homogenous group so that it becomes impossible to say that women think this, women think that, which was the way we used to talk. And also, I mean, I think in our time, we did also take on the concept of difference more carefully. But we very much started looking at gender as something that is learned, as a social construction, and also taking on the ideas of Judith Butler that gender is also performed, and also trying to think about how we gain our gender identities. And so what has become much more of an issue is thinking about difference and the way that intersects with different aspects of gender, thinking particularly about sexual orientation, ethnicity, faith, issues of disablement, of age, and of income. And it was feminist authors from America, such as Bell Hooks, who pointed out that the women's movement was in danger of becoming a representative of white, educated, middle-class women who quite often occupied a privileged position in society compared with ethnic minority, low-income men. And so we have had to take on those aspects of difference. And I think in the US and in Britain, we've also had to take on thinking about gender identities in a much more fluid way. Homosexuality has been recognised legally in the UK since 1967, but latterly there's been more of a movement to look at the built environment in terms of queer politics, of understanding gender, and I must thank my colleague Heidrun Vankiewicz from Austria, who produced this diagram, taking these different aspects of gender, the gender identity, which we socially constructed, the way in which we express gender, how that intersects with biological sex, and then how we express our sexual orientation, which can move from heterosexual, bisexual, homosexual. So critique also about the heteronormative concepts within society. So perhaps we haven't got terribly far with thinking about how this intersects with our practice within the built environment. Other professions maybe have been able to work on it more, health services, but it certainly makes us think about stereotypes. And also the gender and development expert Caroline Moser has talked about how we have moved beyond a welfarist approach towards women. And I know that was something I was accused of in my PhD thesis, of seeing women as victims or as an oppressed group, and so the efforts about empowerment, but more demanding real change in power relations, but not treating women, as I say, in this as a homogenous group. So it's thinking about the way in which what Woolby describes as a public patriarchy, how policies and hierarchies and concepts are enshrined and embodied in policy and provisions that we need to look at. So next to turn to gender mainstreaming, which arguably has been one of the great gains of the feminist movement since the Treaty of Amsterdam in the first few, early decades of the 21st century. And this is the UN definition. So gender mainstreaming is about a strategy. It's about achieving that goal of gender equality. And it's about going into all aspects of policy, all aspects of planning. So it's not just about how many women do we have as councillors, how many women do we have as architects or planners, how many men are they, where are they in their hierarchy. That is important, of course, but it's not just about the body, but it's about the ideas, the institutions, and it should follow through into every aspect of governance. And this is where we can connect up with urban planning. Looking at how does this relate to built environment studies, we found that one of the most important concepts has been that which has come from Scandinavia, the idea of the infrastructure of everyday life. And again, the European Commission played a role in commissioning the research and the researchers who came up with this concept. And here they argued that the conceptual model, I'm afraid the writing's too small for you to read, but the way they see the gendered model as being on a different scale, if you like, of the spectrum, and going from the European scale to national, to regional, to the city or town, to the neighbourhood, to the personal and to the individual. And they contrast the physical and economic emphasis, the expert-led emphasis, the emphasis on agencies, the way that infrastructure is compartmentalised between different divisions, planning, transport, water, energy, housing, all different. And the remoteness of positivist planning, and argue that an infrastructure of everyday life approach is much more about experience, it's more bottom up, it values personal support, it values collective action and and we're gathering together, looking at experience. And I noticed that in the summer school room, I think somebody already has a copy of the Barcelona collective of women, the Lectzia Maríon 6, who've written a book about the participative techniques for their gender mainstreaming activities, which I'll talk about later. But they have usefully gathered together some concepts for everyday life, and basic to that is the equal participation of household members in domestic activities and caregiving. And it's also about the everyday environment, and this is quite challenging to planning because it's defining the everyday environment as people-centred and not about the administrative unit. So whereas we're used to, say in the UK, we just think of the unit that elects the formal hierarchy of councillors, here they are talking about the everyday environment in terms of ownership, identity, housing, social spaces. And taking this perspective of everyday life, the activities which we all engage in, and here they include everything, entertainment, and fundamental needs, caring needs, so that it takes as its basis real life experience. And so the model for this attitude or approach to planning is to reconcile personal work and social lives and to make time, interests, obligations, duties compatible. And then it also challenges the way in which we think about transport, rather than thinking about transport as just particular modes. Oh, what's the bus route? How do the trains work? It's actually thinking about what is the network of movement that people use as they go through the city. Also about the social infrastructure, the network of facilities and services that support everyday life, which includes commercial facilities as well as socially provided or state provided. And then another useful concept which many of us as feminists will be familiar with is the concept of the double shift, of the work that people do in terms of their production, the economic basis of their life, earning money, and reproduction, the caring responsibilities. And then there may be a triple shift on that, top of that, of community organising. And so the leader of our network for Gender STE argued that if we were to actually really take these ideas very seriously and embed them in the urban environment, we would, one, recognise the value of unpaid work. Secondly, we would provide it with equal value rather than as something else that has to be done, and actually the real life is about paid employment. And this would transform our urban environment and would challenge gender roles as we know it, and transform cities. So, and the argument is that this would make life better for everyone. So, how to do it? Well, in planning processes, this comes from the Austrian Gender Handbook. They argue that it's a complete planning process, that we move from analysis of the present situation to framing objectives, to then making propositions for change, whatever they might be, implementing them, and then evaluating them and feeding that circle around. But I think more than that, my colleague in Austria, who I think writes very good work on gender-sensitive urbanism, Doris Damjanovic, argues that we should take in thinking about values, we also need to think about the symbolic dimension. What are the norms and values? What are we aiming towards? I think when we were walking around the market today, Ashley, our group leader, was saying, well, what is our vision? What are we aiming towards? And that's very difficult, I think. That is difficult to see. But Doris is basing this idea on the idea of the French sociologist Henri Lefebvre, where he talks about the production of space. So on the one level we talk about space as a commodity, as a resource. How much is allocated to this? How much is allocated to that? What is this floor space worth? That abstract view that we're encouraged to have as urbanists, or that, you know, in the economy, that's the one that holds sway. Then there's this everyday life argument, life as we experience it. But then Lefebvre was also talking about the space of imagination, the space where we imagine the transformation that might happen. And I think this slogan is, though it may seem very idealistic, it is gaining some power and some purchase again. In the UK, in the left, we now talk about another world is possible. And we talk about transforming the world. So transformation can be there, but you know, we have to move towards it. And we do have problems with that. We have to think about the representation, the relationship of space and place, the extent to which it's about segregation and mixing, exclusion and inclusion, issues of identity, issues about media and representation. I know in the summer schools, Fitlan has been talking about advertising and the way it impinges and, if you like, inhabits our worlds. Now we have billboards and printing presses that could produce adverts that cover the whole of buildings. The example on the right is a particularly bad example from the UK, where they were trying to recruit nurses and produced this sexist imagery. It was protested against and then taken away. And then, of course, we have sexual objectification itself that happens in the everyday environment. Now, the sociologist Phil Hubbard in the UK argues that, you know, it's a moral issue, the extent to which we accept the appearance of sex establishments on the high street. But it can also be about discomfort, about an objection on different grounds. But these spaces are elements of another world that are impinging on our understanding of what our identity is and our representations of the world. And then we have to also think about trying to avoid sort of rather crass stereotyping in terms of imagery. This again is an example from the UK, and this was the entrance to a street, is the entrance to a street called Brick Lane, which is in an area which has been occupied, inhabited by the Bangladeshi community. And it's become called Banglatown because it has lots of Bangladeshi restaurants that people go to in the city. So there was one proposal for the gateway on the left there that would look like a hijab, you know, like a Muslim woman's veil. But there was a great deal of objection to that, saying, well, look, this is just stereotyping an area and stereotyping Muslim women. And so what was eventually built was something much more neutral. So these are the kind of aims and objectives. And I know in the summer school you're looking at tools and techniques, and I'd just like to talk about, just remind you of the power of some of these. One of the issues we've been arguing for in gender STE, and different countries do it differently. Austria is fantastic. One is to produce gender disaggregated statistics so that you have some very clear idea of the spatial, how inequality is experienced in space. And this can be not just about women, it also shows up the inequalities that men have. For example, men are much more likely to be the victim of a violent crime. Men also live shorter lives. And then looking at how that intersects and doing a gender audit of difference and the relationships to household structure. And this has been really useful in terms of reinterpreting statistics, looking at particularly issues like transport around the city. These are some figures from the UK, and they show that the differences between white and black, and also between females and males, and the difference that age makes, and the kind of trips that people make around the city. And what my colleague Ines did was to reinterpret the statistics using the idea of the infrastructure of everyday life, arguing that if you, instead of having this silo mentality that shopping is somehow very different from care work, we have to shop to feed ourselves, to feed others we care for. Escorting is also care work. And then we can start to discuss how much of a resource, I know you're talking about gender budgeting, you place in terms of the transport system on these different activities between paid employment and unpaid. And then there's also qualitative methods, which are very important in terms of mapping everyday experience, and I will show some examples of that later on. And this is from two actual feminist practices. This is from Anne Thorne Architects. Anne Thorne and Fran Bradshaw were members of the original Matrix group, and they've carried on gender-sensitive architecture. And they use very simple technologies. We don't necessarily need to use GIS and lots of representational tools. They just use stickies, little post-it notes to say, to get views, and to do this systematically. And this is actually from an urban planning, not experiment, an urban planning intervention from the Barcelona collective. And there again, they got people from the local area, women from the local area, to write down their experiences. So these kind of qualitative methods, which are sometimes scorned as being too anecdotal, help to give us a much fuller picture of what is needed, how to support that infrastructure. And this, we can look to academic support from Leonie Sandercock, who wrote that book, Cosmopolis, who talked about the importance of listening to women's stories and people's stories. So again, we need to see how implementation can take this all the way through the planning process. It's not just about little spaces, it's not just about the design of the flat, it's right through all spatial scales, and also integrating different disciplines. And a key challenge is land use planning and transport, integrating those. So within our network, Lisa Harelli from Finland, who writes a lot about particularly e-communication and gender and new methods of participation. In her latest article, she's set out sort of the way different tools, techniques, different ways and methods of gender mainstreaming. So she suggests they can also go through different axes. Yes, gender mainstreaming can be formal and expert-led, and to a certain extent top-down. And it can also accommodate advocacy planning, which is bottom-up and citizen-led, so top-down. And on the more informal citizen-led, it can be, but this might be organised, the gender-sensitive advocacy might be organised in a top-down way by the local authority, by the municipality, by the state, or it could be self-organised and totally bottom-up, totally from women's collectives, or she talks about co-governance with public-private partnerships, and this is very much the favoured model in our certainly UK and European experience. So I'd just like to pause a little there and just to ask you, because I don't know, does the Ukraine and does Kiev have gender mainstreaming in any, in the way that I've discussed? Is that part of your planning processes?
Not at all on the local level.
Sorry?
Not gender mainstreaming at all in the planning in the local level.
Mm-hmm.
We do have some mainstreaming on the level of governance,
Mm-hmm.
power,
Mm.
but not in that way.
It was a great push from the donor community to include that into the in all spheres of everyday life, but it really goes very slowly. There is a lack of understanding, especially from the government, I guess, why it's important.
Mm.
And from more successful and less successful initiatives, but there is no really something that you would call like a strategic plan.
Yeah, yeah. It's the, yes.
In the government level, we declaring that gender mainstreaming is important for us, but no one understands what is it exactly. And we are trying to show the Western civilization that it's important for us, but if we're talking about the government leaders, they are not understanding what is it.
Right. Yes. I think that's fairly generalised experience. How about in the rest of the Ukraine? Is there gender mainstreaming in any of the other towns and cities?
Same situation. Actually, just my personal view that in Ukraine there is no some gender mainstreaming right now in planування, so it just begins to appear. But if we compare the eastern part, the central part, and the western part of Ukraine, we can say that there is some division of typical urban planning and counter urban planning as that characterizes more the western cities and towns. So we can divide like typical or somehow human oriented.
Yes. So there is some emerging shoots. It sounds like.
It rises.
Yes, for gender mainstreaming, but it sounds like there's quite a task in trying to work out what it is and what form it might take. So what I'd like to do now is to move on to discussing some examples from that quadripartite diagram, and then also to look at some critiques of gender mainstreaming, because as we said at the beginning, it's a strategy and not a goal in itself. So what I'd like to do now is to take some examples from Vienna, from Barcelona, and a couple from London. So when I move on to Vienna, I think we do have to remember that Vienna had a particularly advantageous context to approach gender mainstreaming within. It is a small city. It has a very historic, dense, compact core. It has a very good transport system, low car use, a very strong history of municipally provided housing and comparatively low rents, a very high proportion of green space. It's consistently been voted as one of the most livable cities in the world. But one of the arguments about why it is also is that it has enacted and implemented gender mainstreaming very thoroughly. And one of the privileges of being in the German network is that Eva Kehl, who was one of the key movers behind gender mainstreaming in Vienna, is a member of that group, and we, have been lucky to be able to hear her talk and talk to her, have her input a lot. And so they've had really almost 20 years of gender mainstreaming, or certainly at least a decade and a half, which started with an exhibition and then setting up a women's office, so to represent women, and then moved into this very long name by British terms, the Special Office for Coordination for the Needs of Women and Planning and in Construction. And this took quite a comprehensive approach to gender mainstreaming, with competitions for women architects, for inputs to transport and movement, inputs into parks and park designs, inputs into district plans, inputs into design guidance, setting standards, benchmarking, and also procedural guidance, gender budgeting, gender auditing, all taken very, very seriously. So multiple levels, and what Eva always says is about how you need this attention to detail, attention to the design process, to the quality and standards, and also to the whole process of evaluation and monitoring, how well things work. So often in the built environment we see a new stunning architectural design, a new urban plan. It's given a prize. Everybody has photographs of it. Everybody puts it on their presentations. How often do we go back and really evaluate it and say, how well did it work? Did it do the job we thought it was going to do? What can we learn from it? And so this cycle of that I showed at the beginning is one of the things that they've really taken seriously. I mean, down to the extent that in walking around the new town of Aspern-Seestadt, which Vienna is developing outside in its periphery, Eva Kehl would say, oh look, there's some benches without arms on. these are very bad for old people because they need an armrest. So it is, and she says that we shouldn't be scared of adopting standards, benchmarking, quality measures, not to feel that this is a restriction on freedom. Her argument is that in order to explain to the officers in the municipality what gender mainstreaming meant, they needed, which she calls it sort of woodcut, this is what kind of standards or provision we are asking for. So I think there is a tension there, that certainly architects don't like curtailments on their freedom to be creative. So there's also a tension with urban planning where we do set standards, but that needs to be addressed. The programme that they followed did follow the everyday life perspective, and this was made easier because of the compact nature of Viennese development and of its compact urban form. And maybe in looking at these examples, one might think about, well, relating it to much larger cities like here, how can we do that? So it also, in the gender handbook, there are so many guidelines and suggestions for improvement, but we can also pull out some strategic principles that, yes, we have this aim of compatibility of family duties, household duties and paid work, equitable resource distribution through awareness of spatial needs. So that's about thinking about, well, who's disadvantaged? Who needs more space? Who needs better quality space? I think Ashley said today, everybody has a right to a good environment, and I think that's right. They argue for a polycentric urban structure, a city of short distances, and that is something we might think about. High quality public space, environmentally friendly public transport, a safe city we can all move around in, and attention to the requirements of daily life. And one of the examples, famous example that really stood the test of time, is the Frauenwerkstatt, which is a housing development in the inner suburbs of Vienna. You can see there it is. And this has an interesting urban form. It's sensitive to its context. It has a connection between two streets, a main tram line, so it helps to create the connected city, which we can also think of as being gender sensitive. It offers semi-private spaces, a pattern of courtyards, semi-private spaces, private spaces, a walkway, and further inner courtyards, and you can see these courtyards here. So looking to fulfill the needs of different household types, and it was the subject of a competition which was only open to women architects, and provides this very comfortable, safe space. It has a lot of social infrastructure. There's a doctor's surgery, there's a police station at the entrance, and as I say, these different routes through the development. And here you can see it as a principle of good urbanism. It really addresses the street, and we have commercial services and social infrastructure here at the front of the development, and this is the police station here, which in some ways you might find that over-controlling, but also thinking about moving around the city. It's so important that people feel safe and can access everywhere in a city at any time of the day and night. And I took these slides 2 years ago when I was doing a guest professorship in Vienna, and these are the semi-private areas on some of them across that main thoroughfare going through the development. And I think you can also get a sense of how the blocks relate to this area. There's children's rooms, there's different laundries, different social infrastructure there, and how varied it is. It's quite a welcoming, human-scaled space, and you compare that to the kind of high-rise blocks, the slab blocks, the point blocks that are arranged in barrack-like fashion from a more programmatic, if you like, approach to urbanism. And this is some of the other spaces. And that's a little, one of those inner courtyard spaces that provides a very, quiet and calm environment for small households and children. The programme also mainstreamed parks, and the park design, I think, is one of the triumphs of their activities. And they've used surveys in their park designs, really using sociology, social surveys, and finding, as much other research has also found, that there are differences in the way that girls experience parks. Quite often they're harassed by older boys, and some boys are also challenged by other boys, and girls are often subjected to sexual insults or threatened sexual aggression. So what they did was to think about what are the solutions, and it was about, again, providing resources, provision for games, for the kind of games that girls have environment, but also niches, little sitting spaces for privacy, and thinking about safety. So in this park, for example, they saw a desire line across the park and the green space, and in their redesign made sure it was there and made sure it was well lit. And also about making the space clean with good toilets. The boys and young men had much simpler demands and for football and skating ramps, which they were able to provide. And then looking at the carers of young children, which might be male or female, and what they wanted was separate play areas with benches and tables that they could look into, places in the shade, access to water, clean and functioning toilets, tables where they could change their infants, and lighting so the park could be used at dusk. So that's a sustainable, using the park as a sustainable resource. And this, I think, is very nice. When I was there, I did an exercise with the students, landscape architects, and we looked at particular examples of public space design. And this is the Odeon Park. And they carved out space within the blocks. So it's not about, huge dramatic gestures. It's more analysis, simple looking at what's around, creating a space under a building and carving out a highly effective and very pleasant public space that doesn't have a lot of fancy materials. It doesn't have stainless steel furniture. Very simple paving, asphalt, using the see-through fencing so you can look at the small, the small children. The benches are standard offer. So we don't need grand architectural gestures, is my argument. What we need is sensitivity to human beings and what they need and desire. And, taking in the needs of different sectors of the population. Immigrant men who might want to sit and talk. And this is another park designed by Rita Meyerhofer, a Viennese landscape architect. And this is a platform where the young girls could talk. Another project was Maria Hilfer, also quite a well-known project, where they looked at the whole of the public realm and the way in which people moved around it. And again, this was based on a social survey, finding that women tended to do more journeys on foot, on bike, on foot and on public transport, and not so much bicycle and car. So what was evolved was a whole series of interventions to make moving around the area easier, particularly as it was a poor neighbourhood with a high proportion of older people. And here you can see the way the space is very cluttered, the difference in levels, very difficult to move around. So again, just simple interventions, widening pavements, 40 street crossings that are made easier, barrier-free pavements, improvements to lighting, and then the big ticket item, a lift in a public space to allow ease of movement and additional seating. It's not rocket science. It's something that's easy to do. So that's just some examples from Vienna, but there are a lot more, and if you go to the book Fair Shared Cities, you can download some of those. I'd now like to move to a more bottom-up. If that was an example of top-down comprehensive gender mainstreaming, this is more bottom-up, but with the agreement of the municipality. And this is from the Punt 6 collective in Barcelona. And here they had the support of a law in Catalonia supporting women's participation in urbanisation and also neighbourhood development. And so they do work with local women, the action-oriented work. They produce these publications, and they do things like community mapping, guided walks where people write down what's wrong. They use this as awareness raising. They also do the kind of mapping, as I showed, with these stickies, with suggestions. And one example was in a suburb called Granollers, where they had 98 women plus 89 children divided into 6 workshops. And then they fed into the redesign of the main square. So they were assisting in empowerment. In the UK, we have a gender equality duty, and it covers other inequalities as well. And for years, we also had a women's design service, which was created by feminist architects getting together. And it produced design guidance, ran participation groups, training groups, and provided a resource and a library. But eventually it came to an end, and it was really because I was a trustee at the point at which it ended. We really relied on support from the municipality, and once that went, it was difficult to survive as a group. And we also found that the emphasis on diversity, on the multiple levels of inequality, tended to decrease support for gender issues. And so that's the quote from the then director of the group, so that the municipality would say, oh, well, you're looking at gender, but we don't just want to think about gender, we want to think about all these other inequalities as well. So we somehow got flattened out of that, which was very unfortunate. But in another example, this is much more bottom-up self-organisation, and it shows how there is a need still for representation. This is E15 are a group of single mothers who are housed in a hostel in East London. Their estate was due to be regenerated, and the municipality, the Greater London Authority, well, I think it was Newham Council, proposed sending them 200 miles away, and they built up a community. So they made protests, they squatted a building, they had an open house that's a joking reference to the architecture open house, and they are still there. So that's one end of the spectrum. But in North London, a much richer end of the spectrum has been able to achieve co-housing. So this is a public-private initiative between the municipality, between an older women's group, and they have 17 flats which the older women own, and then another 8 flats which are socially rented, where the municipality owns it. And this is a co-housing scheme from Chelmsford that is both male and female. So those are some of the examples of gender mainstreaming, covering different aspects of the urban environment. But what are the criticisms of gender mainstreaming? Well, one, this whole problem of it being easily conflated with women's issues and just then either being sidelined or seeing women as victims, and not really taking in the issues of diversity, or conversely, as we saw with the women's design group, of gender as an issue, as a category, disappearing, and or else, even worse, gender issues not being challenged because of cultural sensitivity. For example, we had a terrible example in the UK where Asian taxi drivers were sexually abusing young white girls and accusing them of being prostitutes in defence. So, and they weren't challenged sufficiently about this. This went on for years and then was uncovered. So it's about asserting the importance of gender inequality, but in the context of other measures of difference. And then, as we said, some of you have said, it's difficult for members and officers in a municipality, as for practitioners, to understand what gender mainstreaming might mean. What do we mean by it? How can we achieve it? And I've given some of the examples. And then sometimes these might be said just to be simply good practice in planning. You know, we widen the pavements, everybody can move around more easily. Isn't that just good practice? Isn't that just good planning? Isn't that just human-based good architecture? And there I think we have to my answer to that will be to fall back on saying, well, how much are we valorising? How much do we value unpaid work? What importance are we giving to it? If it's good planning, are we really supporting these aspects of gender sensitivity? Are we providing the resources to do these social services, to evaluate, to monitor who's using the parks, to look at how well these interventions have worked? Then there's a criticism that it creates a new style of feminist bureaucrats, femocrats. Now, Innes argues, what's so wrong with that? It's more jobs for women. But you could also say that the whole language of gender mainstreaming is very clunky. It sounds gender budgeting, gender auditing. It all sounds very formal. It all sounds very, bureaucratic. And that can also be off-putting and not inspirational. So that is an issue, but that can be tackled. And then there's another argument that if it's taken in a top-down way, does it detract from the kind of bottom-up women's organisations? And, well, that's a point of discussion, I would think. And then, actually, if we really do take the infrastructure of everyday life seriously, we are challenging some economic and other aspects, or there's contradiction with different approaches that we might take. Can we really achieve a city of short distances in a world where capital, the money, is going into very large buildings, large organisations, large agglomerations of urban development? How do we create a polycentric city, particularly when we have to take on the legacy of past urbanisation? You know, do we have to retrofit dormitory suburbs? Or do we push for completely new settlements? So, you know, how do we do this? And in terms of good practice, we might say, yes, we want to support public transport, but this isn't always possible. There's a very good issue on gender and planning that Innes edited, and in that there's an article where one woman argues for the low-income women's use of cars in the USA, because that's the only way, in the absence of public transport, they can move around. So it does mean sort of challenging lots of our ideas. So to sort of sum up this part, we're talking about reasserting the right to the city and our rights to access the city fully. Reasserting, getting recognition for different groupings within society.
Can you please put that slide back?
Yes.
The other one, for equal rights.
Oh, yes,
That's
sorry.
very important.
Yes. We want equal independent access to housing and land rights. I must say, since I've paid off my mortgage, I do feel much more independent. And actually, I mean, so many women are coerced into poor living situations because they don't have access. And of course, you know, poor immigrant men are as well. Freedom to move in public spaces without fear of violence or sexual harassment. A right to representation, a right to have your voice heard. Rights to access social infrastructure, and that's being taken away so much with neoliberalism, that we have to pay for education. The UK has the highest fees for higher education, virtually, well, certainly in Europe. healthcare. There are so many companies that want to move in on healthcare, childcare, looking after social care has been a big issue in the UK. Who looks after older people? And across Europe, the population is ageing. And then, I'd never thought we'd say it in the UK or Europe, but the right to clean air. You know, there are so many diseases caused by a poor air quality and through the use of cars, and access to green spaces. And maybe I've missed some things out, maybe you can add to this list. So it's about rights, about recognition, and moving beyond maybe individual welfare to thinking more about collective welfare. And here I pose the difference between, this is from, I think, a sustainable, one of the sustainability websites. This is very much London imagery, but, you know, the driverless car, cycling, you know, nice green environment, compared with the terrible tragedy of the tower block that caught fire in the UK because all the regulations had gradually been disbanded. So I'd argue, what I've been arguing for is for regulation, is for social provision, is for social welfare, and for funding and resourcing people who can evaluate, monitor, survey, and who are democratically accountable as well. And also, you know, we found we need champions. Ava Kale was a tremendous champion in Vienna. The Women's Design Service had Wendy Davis as a champion. Often you find you need a political champion or an individual person who is going to push the agenda. So I'd like to stop at this point for Q&A with this quotation from Caroline Moser, where she's talking about collective action to challenge fundamental inequalities and to move beyond a narrative about women's vulnerability and exclusion, and also maybe beyond just practical needs, but thinking about identity, representation, some of those issues that are raised in the beginning of this lecture. So perhaps I could pause there for questions and comments and thoughts and anybody who disagrees. Okay, so do we have thoughts? Yes, good. Perhaps I can...
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm a sociologist, and I wonder the issue of public transport and prevention of violent sexual harassment. In Ukraine, as in other post-Soviet countries, there are still so-called night trains, where we take a train during night. It's quite long. And there are different ideas that are debating sometimes for the sake of prevention of violence, for example. Is it okay or not to have segregated wagons, for example, only for women, yeah, and for men separately, or like for women and mixed? I think that is similar where in Belarus, as far as I know. And so what do you think on this segregation? Is it solving the issue of prevention of violence? So it's first question. And the second one, it's the issue of prevention of sexual harassment in very packed transport like subway, for example here in Kiev. Which practices do you believe of prevention of sexual harassment and violence in such type of transport are okay, which are not?
Did everybody hear the question, two questions about sexual harassment? Could I just take a hand, who would be in favour of segregated transport at night, segregated by sex?
Окремі вагони для жінок і змішані або окремі для чоловіків.
And probably family.
who is against it? So it looks about equal across the room.
And who are not decided yet?
And you're against or for?
No, I'm not. I'm ambivalent.
And who's ambivalent? And some people don't mind. So yes, there are arguments for and against. Personally, I am against because I think it could create more vulnerability to put women and families in, and supposing it's a family, a man, a woman, and their children travelling together. Does this mean the man's got to go in another carriage?
No, it's actually, we meant like family, and
Yeah.
a man and a woman. A
Yes.
single man, single man.
Okay. I would be against that and would argue instead that perhaps we should have different types of measures. Why not pay for guards on the train? Why not have very heavy fines, prosecution? I mean, some of the problem is that stations are not staffed. I don't know if that's true in the Ukraine. That, there's nobody that, certainly that happens in the UK, there's nobody actually at the station. So if you got off the train and said, look, somebody is harassing me. There's also public education against it. And there's, I think it would perpetuate inequalities to have this kind of segregation. One of the good examples I have from London is not about trains, but about taxis at night. And there was a whole operation by the police and by the Greater London Authority to regulate taxi drivers, because the police did some statistical analysis and found that there was a rise in the sexual harassment, in fact rape, of young women who'd been out having a good time, maybe weren't entirely aware, and unlicensed taxi drivers were taking advantage and either harassing them or, even worse, assaulting. So what the Greater London Authority did was to start what they called a Safer Travel at Night initiative, and this was targeting those taxi drivers. So they had, not blaming the women, so they had a film about prevention, about saying, look what you're getting into, don't jump into an unlicensed taxi. But they did it in a very sensitive way. They got a very good filmmaker, Mike Lee, to make a short film, and he had a film of a taxi driver who talked about how he'd driven around and he'd committed all sorts of crimes, and then he'd been able to get to buy a car, become a taxi driver, and then how he could, then you see him then drawing up next to a woman saying, want a ride, love? And you think, oh no, because nobody checked his record, whereas with the licensed taxi drivers, their criminal record for harassment would have been